Hi, folks, with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about a subject I've touched on before: the demographics across the first world, the Western world, of declining birth rates, and this is amongst the wealthy economies. So there's some concern that the declining birth rate is some apocalyptic Armageddon type scenario, and whatever the current trend is of declining birth rates, this will stay cast and fixed in concrete forever, for all time, and thus the population will cease to exist in a population of the Western world will cease to exist after 150 years if the trend continues. Now, the mere assumption that the trend would continue for all time is absurd in itself, given that the trend has gone up and down over time, depending on all sorts of factors, which we'll get into, or some of which we'll get into. But the worst case scenario is cited today amongst the demographers that are wringing their hands is South Korea. Now, the South Korean birth rate has dropped to about one, depending on whose numbers, around 1.1, 1.2 births per woman. This is a relatively recent trend, so it's not the end of the universe, not anywhere near it. And one could argue that the South Korea is overpopulated to begin with. So if it pulls back a little bit, then in overall population terms, then that might be a good thing. Nonetheless, but what is interesting is in the more expensive cities to live in, such as Seoul and a couple of others in South Korea, the birth rate per woman has dropped to 0.5 per woman in her lifetime. So this is incredible. And now the birth rate in South Korea used to be like 3.5 plus births per woman, but this has changed quite considerably. People with larger families in Korea, such as maybe 3 children or more, they often have to leave, as they perceive it, have to leave Korea and go to another country, given the type and the nature and the costs, the structural costs of having children in Korea. Now, why is this happening? Well, the demographers, of course, reach for the first. Well, it's misogyny. It's the patriarchy. This is why there's no births, or too few births. It's the Nazis. It's Hitler. It's swastikas. It's fascism. So rather than deal with the actual issue, they reach for sort of phantom issues that can't be defined and can't be quantified. And so, well, there you go. So that's it. That's what the cause is. Yeah, sure it is. The reality, of course, as always, is different, but not difficult to find. Now, when I was a kid, there were a lot of families around where everyone had 2 children. That was the baseline, or pretty much. You would get some outliers, but that was it. So 2 children, but most families had 3, and quite a few had 4, and even ones more than that. So 4 or 5 children family was not unusual. In fact, there's quite a few of them around. I remember quite a few of them as a kid. And this is all within my lifetime, of course. So to say this is a long-term trend is a stretch, but it went from during the baby boom and even in just coming out on the other side of the baby boom period, the post-World War II baby boom, large families were not unusual. I don't know any. I'm just thinking off the top of my head here. I don't know any family where they had 2 children or less than 2 children, rather. So it was the baseline. Now that's of course changed. So what changed? Is it like the social engineers go, well, it was because of Hitler, the patriarchy, misogyny, fascism? No. You could plot on a chart, and the 2 lines would be in absolute sort of parallel. That as the price of the purchasing power of the paycheck declined, so too did the birth rate. So the two sort of went together. Now, the cost of living is such, certainly today in the Western world, and definitely in the bigger cities like Sydney or Seoul and South Korea, the cost of living is such that other than a very small number of people, 2 incomes are necessary. Now, you could have two above average incomes who choose to live in a lower middle class suburb, and they could afford children because they would have surplus income. But surplus income tends to be put into status symbols like having a nicer house in a nicer area. And, whether you want to call that a status symbol or a repository for future savings or what you want to call it, people mostly want to live in, clean tree-lined streets where there are not hoods and goons roaming around, where, your wife or your daughter can go jogging without being harassed and, poured or this sort of thing. So it's nice to know that your 10-year-old kid can walk to the bus stop and go to school and can do that without, you don't have to worry about, are they going to get murdered today or this or that, those sorts of things. So people want to live in nice areas, and the more expensive the area, the nicer it is, certainly in terms of law-abiding citizens and neatly trimmed lawns and so on and so forth. So most people want to live in those areas. Even radical screaming communist black activists in the United States, the minute they get a few bucks, they move straight to a white area. Can't do it quickly enough. So everybody, an upmarket white area. So everybody wants to live in. So money tends to get put into status symbols, if you want to call it that. So instead of having 2 or 3 children, the people might live in a nicer house and have 1 child, for example. So the cost of living is a big issue, and you can look at the cost of just real estate alone, buying a house. You can look at the cost, and is that relative to purchasing power of the paycheck? And the further as the appreciation of real estate, as in price appreciation, as it took off well past what the purchasing power of the paycheck was, and therefore becoming relatively more expensive, the birth rate declined, and the two, again, you could plot it on a chart almost exactly. So the cost of living, and particularly the cost of real estate, just having a roof over your head, as that price increased, the amount of children, the birth rate decreased. So there's no rocket science here at all, far from it. Now, the purchasing power of the paycheck, as I've mentioned in many other videos, you look at, say, the first apartment I ever rented, it took just under 20% of my take-home pay. That's the cash after tax and everything was deducted. My take-home net pay, it took 20% of that. Today, that same apartment, exactly the same apartment, takes nearly 2/3 of the take-home pay of the paycheck. That just illustrates quite starkly and clearly how much the cost of living has changed, and how much the price of real estate has changed. People are paying more for mortgages and rents and this sort of thing than they ever were, and that money has to come from somewhere else. So it's not like the problem goes away, or it's a problem in isolation or an issue in isolation. Far from it. There's more and more money has to go into paying the rent and the mortgage or whatever. There's more money has to go into that. There's less money to do other things. That's just the straight mathematics of it. So and so that has to come out of, people still need a roof over their head whether they do or don't have children. So accordingly, the only place, they've still got to eat. So the only place or area where they can make deductions is in having a family and procreation and childbearing. So again, straight out arithmetic here. Nothing. You still got to live somewhere. You still need to eat. So those are the two things that just won't go away. And putting a roof over your head is 3 times more expensive in purchasing power terms, 3 times more expensive than it was in say the 1970s. And food is, depending on how you sort of, if you're very, very careful and sign about managing your food budget, you can do it, but that's a labor intensive gig. So food, if you want convenience, is 25% more expensive than it was in 1970. Whether that's bread and so even the staples. You look at, say, milk is probably only about 10% more expensive than it was then, but bread about 25%, and other things more expensive. And if I look at, say, a steak, a steak that I could buy for $1 in the 1970s, that same steak today is like $30, which gives you an idea again to the price inflation of food. So there's no rocket science here. Why have birth rates declined? It's because the two things you got to have, a roof over your head and food, have increased much faster in price terms than wages. And again, the only place you can make cutbacks is in procreation. So that's what it's same in careers. It's the same in Australia and the United States and Canada and elsewhere. So that's the cause of it. Until putting a roof over your head is related to purchasing power of the local average wage paycheck, until that relationship is brought back into line, then the low birth rates, I believe, will continue. Now, the South Korean government, over the 15 years ago, became quite alarmed at the downhill trend on births. So they did try and intervene, and they've thrown a lot of money around trying to subsidies for childcare, that type of sort of thing. They've intervened, but it hasn't really sort of changed anything. The downward trend continued. It might flatten out for a year or two, but then continues to go downhill. So there are a few others. Now you can argue about status symbols. Again, people want to live in a nice house in a nice area, but to write that off as a status symbol is not quite true. Again, people like to live in nice, quiet areas with well-behaved neighbours. You don't necessarily get that in lower, areas of lower socioeconomic status. You often get people who are far more difficult to get on with and far more prone to crime and have very poor impulse control and things like that. So, and if you look at crime statistics around any big city, they're very much confined to these lower socioeconomic areas. So you can understand why people want to live in areas where there isn't crime. But once you start looking at these nice areas in any city, Sydney included, then you must have two incomes. So the idea of either partner, or the woman stopping work for anything other than the minimum amount of time is they just can't afford. You've got to have two incomes if you're going to live in that nice house in that nice area. It's just unavoidable. So again, it comes back to sheer economics here. There was a time when the guy working in the factory could afford to support a dependent wife and 2.4 children and buy a basic house and have a basic car and that sort of thing. But it could be done on a factory worker's average wage income. I mean, there's not even a snowball's chance of that today. So if a government is going to intervene and say, well, we need to correct this, we need to do something about it, or at very least we need to be hovering around replacement level births, then they have to intervene in the property market. Property has been residential property, homes has moved from being a place of shelter where you bring up your family. It's moved from that to being an international investment asset that's traded by the Black Rocks and the big banks and so on. So and as long as it remains that, residential real estate, homes is just a plaything for the investors, the international investor class, and it's never going to be affordable for people who are on the average wage. When it does become affordable at the average wage, then people will start having children again, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Some technical adjustments with food could be made. Now there are things that could be done, like for example, say for example, a mother has a child, and then she quits work to look after the child. Nothing wrong with that. But then, so say she's home for 5 years, for example, looking after the child before it starts school. When the woman goes back to work, can she get 5 years of not having to pay income tax? For each year she takes off, she gets a year doesn't pay a penny in income tax. For example, I'm not saying that is or isn't the way, but for example, then that would go quite a way to making up for the lost income during the time when the mother was at home, or can a loan of some type, like a zero interest loan, be extended for the period, say 5 years, and then that's paid back when the woman returns to work, but then she gets a tax-free sort of holiday there, tax-free vacation, which is in effect paying back that loan. There are certainly ways of addressing this which encourage people to have children and consider the consequences of a lost income, for example. And things, so there needs to be a lot of creative thinking put into this. Now, on top of that, there's all sorts of social engineering issues that equity outcomes and all sorts of perverted socialist notions of equality. Why can't men have babies, and that sort of stuff, and going down these ridiculous and absurd, insane rabbit holes which get nowhere, achieve nothing, produce nothing, and solve no problems. Now, I don't see lower birth rates as a problem in themselves, because there'll be a natural point and level at which, when the population declines to a certain extent, then the price of real estate will come down anyway, because there are fewer buyers and there are fewer people wanting to enter the property market, assuming market forces are allowed to operate, which they may not be. The big financial institutions may come in and just soak up all the surplus real estate in order to artificially pump the real estate prices. But no, if market forces are allowed to work, which they're currently not, by the way, in the property market, if they're allowed to work, for example, when I say they're not allowed to work, offshore buyers are buying anywhere between 25 and 40% of all big city Australian real estate, residential real estate. And that's massively pumping up the price of real estate. Now market forces mean the average wage and the purchasing power of the local indigenous population. That's what it means. And that is the market forces. And as long as property returns to the mean there, then by extension and by natural sort of organic methodologies or natural organic development, then people will start procreating again. And by the way, there's a huge number of women who are doing shit, horrible jobs that they hate. The idea that women love these wonderful, important, status conscious jobs in downtown air conditioned offices where they're all chief executives on megabucks. That's a bullshit illusion. There's a lot of women who hate the jobs they're at and would happily consider alternatives if it was economically viable. So these are the things that we need to think about. When you look at South Korea, though, they've also got, in addition to that, there's this idea that came along, certainly in the 70s, emanating really from the United States, that everyone had to have a degree now, or should aspire to having a degree. And that was okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And it's quite competitive in South Korea, getting to the right school, getting to the right university, these sorts of things. Although, if their education system is so rigorous and so on, when I work with South Koreans as colleagues, I don't see the benefit. If they are better educated, it's gone over my head. So fuck knows how they're determining higher education and rigorous standards there. It certainly doesn't come across when I work with them. But anyway, maybe it's only the South Koreans I don't meet who are the geniuses. But this idea of everyone having a degree or aspiring to have a degree, there's nothing wrong with that, because that would have raised the overall stat. As long as they kept the standard independent, impartial, and rigorous, then you'd have more kids working harder to achieve better educational outcomes. Getting a degree, getting a better grade degree, or getting a master's and PhD or whatever. And that's not a bad thing in itself. But instead of that, and particularly in the West and the United States, Australia too, it went the other way, where, well, if we want people to aspire to a degree, there are going to be losers. There are people that just aren't going to get the degree if we have rigorous, impartial, independent standards. So what we'll do is just get rid of all the standards. Everyone can have a degree. So the degree became not a degree as an indication of one's educational achievement, but it became just a participation trophy. So everyone's got a fucking degree now that they haven't earned and didn't have to meet any independent, rigorous standard. And this caused, of course, especially with women going into gender studies degrees, that meant that they were staying at university for a few more years. Then they were getting affirmative action DEI jobs that they couldn't have got under a competitive marketplace, and that your standards were lowered in hiring as well. And then by the time the sort of the facade and the realization it was all a bullshit fantasy hits, and then they're in they're 30 years old and gee, do I really want to have children now? Those sorts of things. So there's also other socioeconomic issues that feed into this. Can it be solved? I believe it can be, but the tough decisions have to be taken. Shelter and food need to be made affordable again. Without that, it's just not going to happen. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.